Hello and welcome to the Business and AI Forum. We have a day of programming focused on showcasing how business and business functions are being impacted by AI technologies. Without a firm understanding of how governance, organizational capabilities, risk management, investments, ROI, and adoption efforts are being implemented, organizations cannot make full use of AI as a competitive advantage. My name is Joaquin Milada, and I am the founder of the Swarm community, as well as the host of the AI Digest podcast. Swarm is a community practice working on ESG problems with open source AI technologies. And in this webinar, James Phare is going to show us why it is important to pave a means for responsible and sustainable financial practices. To ensure that there is integrity and adoption of these practices, we need to operate in a transparent manner. James Phare is the founder of Neural Alpha, as well as Connected Data World, and has dedicated his career to enabling these transparent, responsible, and sustainable investing practices with the usage of advanced semantic technologies. And with that, I pass the mic over to James. It's a pleasure to have you, James.
Thanks, Joaquin. Thanks for the warm welcome and the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Just to check the microphone.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, cool. Great. Okay. So I think the plan is to kind of run through a few slides and a bit of scene setting and a kind of introduction to the space, the intersection of sustainable finance and AI powered knowledge graphs. And then I think we've got 10 minutes for Q&A. Is that right?
Affirmative.
Yeah. Cool. Great. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thanks for the intro. We can get going. So as Joaquin said, I'm James Phare. I'm the CEO at Neural Alpha. I guess I've spent kind of the last 20 years of my career as a kind of fintech person, so mainly working within banks and asset managers, traditionally on more kind of mainstream financial data requirements. I guess I've been working with knowledge graphs and semantic technologies for pretty much, I guess, the last kind of 15 years, and traditionally big focus on areas like financial crime, and then in more recent years pivoting more to focus on sustainable finance. So yeah, really excited to share some of the things that we're working on and the opportunities that we see in this space and some of the challenges, and just share a bit more about the kind of unique opportunity that we see for applying these types of technologies within sustainable finance at the moment, which is an incredibly fast moving, developing space. So I mentioned Neural Alpha, so a bit of an introduction to who we are and what we do. So we're a software and data consultancy specializing in sustainable fintech. We've been lucky enough to win a number of awards for different platforms that we've built over the years, including a number of graph database powered platforms that we've developed for ESG investing and sustainable finance requirements. We're a team primarily of data scientists, data engineers, ESG researchers, and full stack and front end developers. And we primarily work with banks and asset managers and develop tools particularly focused around the kind of the environmental pillar within ESG, with the other two pillars being the social and governance pillars. And we've developed a number of platforms integrating a wide variety of data to tackle issues such as deforestation, human rights, ocean plastics, and more broadly the nature and biodiversity space in particular. Very excited today to share a bit more about, I guess, what personally excites me and where we see this space going. So in terms of what is the space that we're talking about, sustainable finance, I guess many would be forgiven for thinking it's a relatively new thing, and indeed it is a fast-growing area at the moment. And 9 out of 10 inflows into the asset management industry are into sustainably labeled funds in the US, for example. So it is a very booming area. But it's not a new area. So obviously ESG has really come about as a recognized term within the previous 10 years. But before that, in previous decades, there are a number of other kind of similar terms used to describe kind of similar principles. So ESG, has some of its roots in the corporate social responsibility space, the CSR space, which was a kind of big thing, particularly in the 90s and beyond. But also roots in areas such as ethical investing and SRI, socially responsible investing. But tracing it right back to its beginning, it's got some very interesting roots actually within the Quakerism movement of the 18th century, believe it or not. So actually a lot of the kind of foundational principles within sustainable investment are often attributed to the Quakerism movement, where the movement established various principles around where they would direct capital and investments to. And one of those key principles was established, for example, in 1758 at the Quaker Philadelphia yearly meeting, which actually prohibited members from participating in the slave trades and the buying and selling of human beings. And then we've seen the Quaker kind of principles extend to cover things like non-investment in tobacco, alcohol, and gambling. And these are principles that we see enshrined in modern ESG funds that the likes of you or me could invest in today. These are the most dominant kind of ESG screens that we see applied to products. So similarly, at the same time in the 18th century, there was another kind of interesting trend happening or invention happening in Sweden at the time. The Linnaean taxonomy, created by the famous botanist and zoologist Carl Linnaeus. And I mentioned these two quite distinct, seemingly unrelated topics now, but they will come together a bit later in the presentation and perhaps make a bit more sense as to the kind of opportunities and the value that's been created with these two different streams coming together in the future. So Carl Linnaeus, he developed a classification system, or the first major classification system for classifying all plants and animals. So the Linnaean taxonomy is this kind of 8-level taxonomical classification system for classifying all plants and animals, and it's now become the most dominant kind of cornerstone classification system within biology and the natural sciences. But more broadly within the AI and connected data space, the implications of this have gone far beyond natural sciences. And he's generally recognized as the father of modern taxonomies, with taxonomies being really the backbone of modern AI applications, powering inferencing and knowledge graphs and all of this exciting space that we work in today. So fast forward a couple of hundred years, and what does this space look like? Well, it's very frenetic, it's very fluid, it's very crowded. And I'll come back in a little bit to some of the opportunities that the two previous slides touched on, and how these are kind of being applied within this space. But first, to just touch a little bit on what this space is all about. it's a jargon-filled space, I think, to be fair. And obviously, being technologists in a fast-evolving area, we're perhaps used to jargon. I would say the ESG space is a kind of jargon on steroids, and particularly an acronym on steroids space. So it's a very fast-moving space, as I mentioned. Lots of initiatives, lots of frameworks, lots of standards, regulations, all developing in different areas around the world, different jurisdictions. Lots of different acronyms, things like CDP, FRAG, ESRS, CDSB, ISSB, you name it. There's pretty much an acronym for everything, and and it's generally recognized as a confusing thing for outsiders, but even for insiders working in the space, it's often confusing what all of these things mean. And I think often the remits of these different initiatives and different tools and frameworks are often quite overlapping and not as neatly delineated as we see in the slides here. Unlike mainstream finance, I think one of the key kind of interesting things about ESG and sustainable finance is it's still a very nascent space in terms of data standards, in terms of technical data standards. So in mainstream finance, post the financial crash, we had a lot of kind of different technical standards emerged, and data standards, vocabularies, ontologies, and so on. And we are yet to really see that. So we're still going through this kind of convergence piece in the world of ESG. And I guess one of the implications of this is it has a very, very rich vocabulary, and that is a challenge for practitioners to manage in its own right. And that is, a unique role which particularly knowledge graphs and semantic technologies, and increasingly AI with large language models is tackling, particularly with things like RAG architectures, being trained in these different standards, and being able to keep up to pace with all the different developments that are ongoing. So that's it's a very unique role, I think, that these technologies can play within this space. Another area, so going back to Carl Linnaeus, who we mentioned earlier, is taxonomies. So, interestingly, and I think this is the more kind of qualitative focus driving this within ESG. So interestingly, taxonomies are very in vogue at the moment in ESG. So there's over 30 different taxonomies, some being developed by regulators, some by industry bodies around the world, looking to essentially create rules or classification schemes for determining which companies or which sectors, which business activities can be considered green, based on things like technical screening criteria and other criteria. Again, obviously, taxonomies have rapidly grown in the kind of knowledge management space and the connected data space as a kind of cornerstone technology, with lots of different, best practices defined, and real opportunities, I think, for applying those within the sustainable finance space. I guess it's important to note here that probably a lot of the taxonomies that are being developed, I think, from a kind of a purist standpoint, I think could possibly be considered more kind of basic classification systems than taxonomies. But it's a start, and I think it's moving the whole field in the direction of being able to start to bring some structure to this sea of kind of data and concepts that's out there. And I think we're really excited to see where this goes, and it can only yield more opportunities for applying more kind of formal controlled vocabulary and taxonomy management within this space. So whether financial professionals are aware of it or not, connected data technologies, although still in their infancy within ESG, are becoming increasingly adopted within this space, and that's something that we're very excited about. So moving on, beyond the kind of traditional semantic challenges and the challenges of unifying around common definitions, common vocabularies, the knowledge graph space, and particularly this intersection with the kind of newer emerging AI and large language model approaches, has a number of other strengths that it can bring to the ESG space. So one of those particular strengths of knowledge graphs is around data integration, and I think we're seeing this. So I touched on that the ESG space is still quite nascent, I think, in terms of data maturity. I think the vast majority of users, and this has been documented in various industry surveys, the vast majority of practitioners are still working predominantly with Excel spreadsheets rather than kind of structured, dedicated ESG analysis systems. So there's a lot of opportunity for leveraging new technologies here, and a really unique opportunity within ESG, because to do ESG holistically and effectively, it does require a huge amount of data, a huge volume of data, but also a huge variety of data. So and covering the full spectrum of data, from unstructured data, things like covering things like disclosures and news reports, also controversies, that kind of stuff, right through to more traditional structured data, things like ratings, ESG scores, and so on, and then a whole plethora of different data types in between. And there are many different data types emerging and becoming very popular in sustainable finance. So things like physical asset locations, facility locations, spatial data has become a huge area. Also supply chains, and increasingly models are becoming much more widely used. So particularly things like input-output models of various kinds to try and model supply chains, and also things like life cycle assessment models, where you're looking at what's the embedded carbon and land use footprints, for example, in everyday products that we purchase and consume. So we know that knowledge graphs are very strong at kind of atomizing data and being able to integrate data from different sources. So that's a very unique value proposition that we see, and something that's increasingly being adopted by leaders in our space. And we're seeing people like BlackRock, for example, have developed an ESG knowledge graph. Also, the World Bank are using a knowledge graph alongside LLMs to meet these kind of data integration and analysis needs. Aside from the traditional data integration value, I think another big benefit of knowledge graphs within the ESG space is around context. So, determining whether an investment is sustainable or not, being able to kind of compute a set of rules to give something a label is incredibly context specific. An investment's sustainability profile is very linked to things like its geographic location or its supply chain impacts, for example. It can also be very person specific. So an investment considered, for example, unethical by one person might be considered to be aligned to the values of another. And also intentionality as a concept is kind of increasingly being looked at by regulators and kind of enshrined in modern regulations, such as the UK FCA's Sustainability Disclosure Requirements Standard, which essentially describes the ability to be able to kind of label something to some degree as being sustainable if you're able to prove that you've been able to achieve positive impact through kind of stewardship and engagement with, for example, a portfolio company. And similarly across other areas, it can be very, very contextual. For example, determining whether an investment is sustainable. For example, just looking at whether it's in a high biodiversity intactness area or a biodiversity depleted area. An investment in both locations could be considered sustainable depending on the objectives and the remit of that investment. So I guess in a sense, it's kind of saying, it's incredibly context specific sustainable finance, and the rules are incredibly complex to determine that. And taxonomies are just a start in terms of simplifying that. But it will become ever richer, these rule sets, and I think that's a really unique area that we're seeing large language models and knowledge graphs playing an increasing role in terms of bringing structure and order to this kind of sea of data that we see. So sharing a bit more about some of the things that we're doing and we're excited about. So aside from consulting projects, one of the things that we're particularly excited about is our software as a service platform that we've developed called Responsible Capital, which is bringing together many of these data sets that I touched on in terms of things like controversies, data, physical assets, supply chain data, and also most importantly, perhaps disclosures, corporate disclosures, into our ESG knowledge graph alongside also data such as news, to enable ESG professionals to utilize an LLM powered AI ESG co-pilot for analysis. And we've been really pleased with the results that we've had with kind of early customers of this tool and people that we've been working with in terms of its ability to save huge amounts of time deploying AI and large language models to traditionally very time-intensive tasks of assessing the ESG profile of companies. And we've been able to get down a typical ESG assessment of a company from days, perhaps 3 to 5 days, to trawl through, often dozens, if not hundreds, of different financial and sustainability disclosures, down to a matter of hours. So it's I guess applying this combination of AI and knowledge graphs to ESG, it really is a game changer in our opinion in terms of cost reductions and also new capabilities. And conscious of time, I think we're at time, but it's a tech talk. So the customary we're hiring slide. So we're always looking for passionate, motivated, impact-centric data engineers. We're also looking for front-end developers at the moment, and also a chief commercial officer. So if any of those things sound of interest to anyone listening in, then we'd love to talk to you. So do drop us an email. And that's pretty much it.
We'll be sure to relay that message in the follow-up communication within the community. But that was a lovely presentation, and I think thank you for clarifying how broad and obfuscated the space of ESG is. So I suppose I have a question for you. Without standards of data and with all these layers of complexity, because there's layers of complexity at an international, at a national, at a regional, at a local level, and they all have their own interpretation of what it means to be ESG compliant or responsible. How are you at Neuro Alpha championing clarity and transparency for clients through these various layers of context?
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge because it's incredibly fast moving as a space, and I think everyone is keen to kind of demonstrate impact and move the space forward. And it is time consuming to develop standards, particularly when it's a completely greenfield space. I guess in traditional mainstream finance, there was a burning platform, which was the financial crisis, that people couldn't understand, credit risk exposures to each other, because there were no standards, for instance, governing, describing legal entities. There was no legal entity identifier back then to uniquely identify a company. I think it's interesting. I think one of the challenges that we have in the ESG space is that there's not really that burning platform at the moment, and I think it may change. There's a lot of interest in kind of anti-greenwashing rules at the moment, and that's becoming increasingly kind of legislated. So perhaps that may become the burning platform. But yeah, I mean, certainly, in terms of the data aspects, we're always interested in other people that are potentially, willing to collaborate around standards. There aren't a huge number of kind of open source taxonomies out there for sustainable finance or ontologies. So that's certainly something that we would be interested in collaborating with others on. Yeah, and it's probably another interesting thing that's worth mentioning is there are a few interesting initiatives going on that may change that space as well in the next few years. So one of the big things that the European Union are doing is launching something called the European Single Access Point, which will become a kind of single data utility for accessing financial and sustainability disclosures. So inevitably, I think that will drive some more convergence, around kind of technical standards. But yeah, it is a challenge, and yeah, certainly we try to kind of nudge clients in the right direction there. But there's obviously a limit to how quickly you can move.
So for now, you're kind of helping do due diligence, look at the relevant data sources, and sort of build this contextualized map as to how they can have a holistic view of the kind of investments that they want to have. And you're also saying that in the near term, in the next couple of years, organizational groups or governments are kind of coming to terms with how to navigate this obfuscation by building some sort of standard platforms or unified efforts to make it more accessible. As you mentioned, it's a big problem that all these companies are greenwashing or finding ways to game the system so that they don't have to pay penalties around all the problematic practices that they still uphold to cut corners, right? So, any other points of insight that you see for the ESG space from the perspective of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last point that you touched on with greenwashing, I mean, it's another area where I think the AI and particularly a knowledge graph space has a strong track record. I guess is in misinformation. So there have been a number of kind of leading projects there. Things like the database of known fakes is quite a well-known one. There's various other projects, but I think that's one thing that people often forget with greenwashing is they think it's some kind of special thing, and actually it's just a form of misinformation where actually, connected data techniques and AI have a unique role to play in terms of ground truthing facts and, debunking misinformation, whether it originates from kind of state actors or from corporates. So I think that's another exciting area, I think, in our space. Yeah.
I've only dipped my toes in the space of finance in a very short term, but I am just blown away at how complex and how interconnected the world is. I mean, you have news publishing, you have social media, you have all these regulatory compliance, you have professional auditing companies that provide reports that showcase the performance of different industries, and then you have these government regulations that are implementing supply chain restrictions and anti-slavery policies and all these things. It's such a rich world. It's not just looking at numbers in a stock ticker. It's looking at how the world moves. So I could see why you are passionate about this area.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing is, particularly in the sustainable finance space, it's it's bringing together a lot of qualitative and quantitative disciplines increasingly. So it's a really exciting, interesting area to be involved in if particularly if you enjoy working in quite broad domains, which is often, I guess, the knowledge graph practitioner's kind of utopia, I guess. So yeah, it's an exciting area, exciting times to be working in it.
If you've been listening in, we invite you to ask any questions in the comments below, and James will be able to go in after this presentation to answer them at his earliest convenience. Also, if you have any particular names on the top of your head around, what is it, commercial officer, chief commercial officer,
chief commercial officer, yeah,
graph
or
data scientist,
front end developer, or a graph database knowledge graph AI fluent data engineer is what we're looking for. Yeah.
Well, James, thank you very much for the lovely presentation. I'm excited to see what happens in the next couple of years in this turbulent space.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joaquin, and pleasure to talk.